Hi everyone, Phil Travis here, Modern Russia, History 448 here at EOU. And today this week we're going to be reading about the consolidation of the Soviet Union from the period of the Bolshevik Revolution until Lenin's death in 1924. So, after the Bolshevik Revolution, Russia and really all of the major satellites that surrounded Russia, the former imperial domains of the Tsarist period, descended into very chaotic civil wars. In Russia proper, the main war, and the one that most people think about when they talk about this period of time, is that between the Reds and the Whites. And of course, the Reds refer to the communists, the Bolsheviks, led by the Red Army, which was led by Leon Trotsky, of course. And of course, recruitment of members to the Red Army was something that the Bolsheviks put a great deal of emphasis behind, and they built up a tremendously large and effective army in this time period. They fought the Whites, and the Whites included a variant of opposition figures to the Bolshevik communist movement. This civil war between the Reds and the Whites, of course, involved terrorism on both sides. The Whites, just like the Reds, terrorized populations. The Whites, in some cases, for example, hung Union leaders. And by contrast, the Reds, the Bolsheviks, openly promoted the use of terror violence against potentially problematic social groupings. So the use of terrorism was often used against particular social classes. The middle class, for example, was in some cases threatened with extermination as a way of terrorizing them and striking fear into them. Terrorism was a tool of control. And at this time, of course, remember, Russia is in a very vulnerable position. German armies, before the surrender in World War I, 1918, German armies were very, very far towards the interior of the former Russian Empire. And of course, there were violent civil wars and opposition to communists as well as to whites throughout Russia and the Russian imperial domains. There were peasant uprisings. It was tremendously chaotic. And so as a result of that, the Russian leaders turned to a consolidation of power, a consolidation ultimately of absolute party power. And this was designed as a way that they could control the situation by increasingly federalizing the system. This led to the creation, most notably, of the Politburo. And the Politburo effectively, in a lot of ways, displaced the powers of the Sovnarkom, which was the government organization that was in place after the revolution, and it continued to be in place, and it would be in place throughout the Soviet period. But the Politburo was created as a way of centralizing power, and the Politburo would be a group of leaders. It was headed by Lenin, of course, and these leaders would oversee economic, political, and international affairs. And over time, the Politburo really becomes the primary authority within the Soviet system. Of course, as this kind of period of chaos and war reigned, the attempts by the Soviet leadership to control economics, their attempts to, for example, to end capitalism and replace it with true communism, were really failing fundamentally. The government rationed supplies only made up a minor fraction of the needs of the peasantry, and this led to the development of a black market within the developing Soviet state. So-called sackmen, who were black market capitalists, basically, would move between towns, and they would trade and they would sell items that peasants needed illegally, of course. And throughout this narrative that Service is telling in the book, of course, you have many cases where the leadership is trying to control things, but they're very unable to control what happens often at the peasant level. And oftentimes, in attempting to control this, they resort to brutal, even terrorism, brutal force and repression in putting down revolts and riots. They were very keenly aware of the danger of instability, and so they went to great lengths to create stability. However, Service mentions that they really are unable to really control the situation, and a black market developed to suit the needs of particularly peasant populaces that were not thriving, to say the least, within the system as it was developing at this time. This image here, of course, is an image of the 8th Party Congress in 1919, and pictured in the middle, of course, you see Stalin and Lenin. And of course, they became central figures in leadership within the Politburo, and both advocated the use of absolute party power, some more than the other, but absolute party power and the use of terrorism to assure adherence to that power was a consistent part of this period, and of course continuing through the history of the Soviet Union. Lenin knew that, and perhaps he knew kind of late, that the Soviet strategy of abolishing capitalism basically was not working. There was a black market that was flourishing. There were huge cases of starvation. There was an abundance of want, particularly with the peasantry throughout Russia and its imperial domains. And of course, this led to peasant violence and peasant uprisings. And understanding the history of the Tsarist period, the imperial period, Lenin really understood the dangers of peasant uprisings, and those threatened to potentially break apart the system, the Soviet state. And so Lenin, in leadership, of course, advocated very harsh and repressive responses to resistance and revolt, but they also changed their approach. And this came in 1920 with Lenin's new economic plan, the NEP. And the NEP by Lenin was effectively a temporary return to capitalism. Now, capitalism in early Soviet state did not look like capitalism in the West. There were no bankers and there were no big industrialists. Instead, it was a kind of needs-based, small-level capitalism. And the NEP men, or the NEP men, were one of the primary agents of this kind of peasant-level capitalism. And of course, there was manufacturing that was allowed, and there were a number of levels of capitalist economic policy or economic behavior allowed, from hiring people to asking for rents to manufacturing to obviously grain sales. But the NEP men were like, in a way, they were like the legal version of the old sack men during the new economic plan. These were tradesmen or businessmen that operated in villages, and they sold and traded items of various kinds, from foodstuff to chairs. The NEP was a return to capitalism, and it was controversial, particularly controversial from figures like Trotsky. And of course, many Bolsheviks believed that this was kind of copying out the goal of communism. But Lenin, was practical, and Lenin, in a lot of respects, he was practical as a leader, albeit very harsh. But Lenin understood, in his view, that what Leninism and what Marxism was something that was always changing to fit needs. And so in this case, one of those needs was growth, was education, was industrialization, was a kind of economic activity that would balance the huge lack of food and basic supplies that were present before the new economic plan was put into place. So this was controversial, but ultimately it was effective. And figures like Lenin, who before his death, Lenin, of course, dies in January of 1924 and was really physically unable to have really any significant power, even in much of 1923, because of the strokes he had suffered. But he understood that, as did others within the Bolshevik movement, that that a return to a kind of temporary return to a certain kind of controlled form of capitalism would allow the country to potentially develop more quickly, allow it to industrialize, allow it to provide economic opportunity that could prevent huge peasant revolts, which is or was something that figures like Lenin feared quite greatly. The Soviet Union, or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, was established in 1922. It was really ratified in 1924. And this was a period in which the old Russian state, the old imperial domains like the Ukraine, Belarus, and the Caucasus regions are the areas between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, north of Iran, countries like Azerbaijan, Georgia, Armenia, and so forth, make up the Trans-Caucasus region. These areas of the former Tsarist Russian Empire were an issue in the early 1920s. And as Russia went to great lengths through force to ensure that these imperial domains remained within the Soviet sphere, they also created a sort of semi-autonomous relationship for them, in which these areas would be created as effectively semi-autonomous regions that were part of this union of socialist republics. Of course, the ultimate authority would go to the leadership in Moscow, but nonetheless, these were semi-autonomous domains. And of course, Stalin him and Stalin and Lenin disagreed over how these domains should be brought into the Russian system. And the issue of nationality and of Russianness and non-Russianness was an important factor in the civil wars and in the consolidation of the Soviet Union. During the civil wars, of course, the whites had alienated many non-Russians because the whites very much played up Russian nationalism. And by contrast, the Bolsheviks, the Soviets, Lenin, Stalin, these people, they were actually anti-nationalist in many respects. And so they played down the idea of Russianness and instead gave many things, if you will, to these non-Russian satellite states. And ultimately, with a vote first in 1922, the first vote in 1922 agreed to include the Ukraine, Belarus, the Trans-Caucasus region, and it established the borders for Russia. These were formally agreed to in 1924, but these were actually establishing formal borders that, in a lot of senses, had not been previously established. Russia's modern borders were established at this area. At this time period. And of course, when Boris Yeltsin became president in the 1990s, this was the first time that there was a Russian state that, in a true sense, really adhered to these borders that were established in 1922. Similarly, the Ukraine, which is, of course, in the news so much nowadays, the Ukraine really before this period was not a state in the traditional sense. It was a collection of semi-feudal kingdoms that owed their allegiance to the Tsar. And so in some respects, this was creations or the creation of new political state elements within the Russian Empire that in a way had not yet existed. But in the process of incorporating these states, like Georgia, for example, there were revolts in some cases that were put down by force. But ultimately, these areas are all incorporated into the greater Soviet Union. And so it's in the early 1920s that the Soviet Union gets its sort of original shape that we all remember. When Lenin died, Lenin had a series of strokes, and of course these debilitated him. And in 1923, he was in a wheelchair and really had lost much of his ability to have any leadership role. And of course, Lenin dies in January of 1924 at the age of 53. And after Lenin's death, there was a great deal of competition for power. And different leaders, like Stalin, for example, sought to use the legacy of Lenin as a vehicle to power. There was a cult of Lenin that was established after his death. Lenin was embalmed and encased in a clear, airtight sarcophagus, if you will, in Red Square, and there was a almost pseudo religion, a cult of Lenin that was created around Lenin. In a lot of ways, this was the Bolshevik attempt to, again, further subvert religion in the country, to create cult of personality in the country as a way, and of course Stalin would do this as well with himself while he was alive, but creating a cult of personality as a way of almost providing a communist replacement for old traditional Russian orthodoxy, which of course Marxism had referred to religion as the opiate of the people. It was the thing that in Marx's mind, and of course Lenin's mind as well, religion kept the populace at bay rather than leading to their natural infuriation at their situation in this world. And so, often referred to as the opiate of the people, the Soviet state, in many respects, sought to dismantle and abolish former organized religions, and in some cases, they replaced these with a cult of personality. In the case in Lenin's death, a cult of Lenin. That would be an almost religious fascination of Russians centered around Moscow and in Red Square particularly. After Lenin's death, there becomes a competition for power. And the competition for power is most earnestly by a united front led by Trotsky, pictured here, and of course by Stalin, who had, through his position as party secretary, Stalin had been in a position of power for appointing people that were close to him. And Stalin is able to use that position to ultimately undermine Trotsky's alliance and place himself ultimately in a position of authority in the Soviet Empire. Of course, Lenin had become, towards his death, quite disenchanted by Stalin. Lenin began to see Stalin as quite crude, and found out about Stalin doing some things that were in his mind excessive behavior for any member of the Politburo. And Lenin increasingly hoped that Trotsky could have been the one to prevent Stalin's rise to power. But Stalin's position within the party apparatus was such that he was able to control many things. And Trotsky ultimately will be run out of the country, and Stalin will rise to power. Stalin will, of course, have Trotsky murdered outside of the country in 1940 as he's tracked down by members of the NKVD and killed. Okay, guys, I hope this is helpful. Let me know if you have any questions. All right, let's have a great week.